This week our theme is life cycles and burials. Your textbook, there's two chapters of your textbooks to read. There's chapter 15 from volume 1 and chapter 12 from volume 2. They're such interesting reading because they're going to talk about burials, but also diseases and life cycles. And the information that I would be talking about in class today would be drawn from the materials that I've put on Nearpod and on Moodle. The first slide on the Nearpod that you've just gone through to get to this point gives like a written overview of the order of doing things. It's not as straightforward as other weeks. So I'm going to reference in this video though where you should go and find the materials, so I give a bit of an overview. So one of the big themes for this week's class is the input and influence of scientific disciplines in our understanding of the past. I think that your textbooks convey this really, really well, and the additional materials that I've given you also reflect this interdisciplinarity. I think it's easy for us historians to forget that actually a lot of our big advances in terms of our historical knowledge have come through collaboration with other disciplines. So we're going to see biological anthropology this week, osteoarchaeology. We're also going to see there's going to be mention about ancient DNA. There's going to be paleopathology. There's also, there's just loads of neat stuff and some kind of gross stuff as well. So to start off, burials, to start off at the end, burials are studied a lot because they provide a lot of material culture, whereas they're also material culture in and of themselves. Burials are a fascinating source of cultural information for most cultures, but particularly when we're dealing with pre-Christian societies and societies that are undergoing religious conversions. So we can see this in the early Middle Ages in Europe most, because remember that Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. But then after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Europe enters the age of migrations. It's when a lot of, and if you could see me now, I'm doing air quotes, Germanic, so-called barbarian tribes were migrating, and they were pagan, and they were then reconverted to Christianity, or newly converted to Christianity, depending on who the society were. So a lot of study has looked at the grave goods relating to these societies as a way to understand pagan societies, proto-literate or pre-literate societies, and also how early Christianity worked. Grave goods are objects that are placed with the deceased at the time of burial, and therefore they're left with the body in the grave when the grave is uncovered. Archaeologically, disentangling the origins and the meanings of the things included in graves can be tricky. Now, today, if you think about when we bury people today, there are actually going to be some grave goods there. So some objects are going to be things like dress fittings. So today, that might be metal buttons, metal zippers, or some personal jewelry. And we kind of have the versions of that in the Middle Ages as well. So we might find dress fittings, personal items worn on the clothing of the deceased. So that actually tells us a bit about like what they were buried in, how people were dressed, what the fashions were like at the time. There's some reconstructions in the Studley article of what the clothes looked like. The faces I find a bit odd looking, but it's really cool that they're recreating the clothing the people wore. Other things that might be placed in graves more deliberately, so more what we think of as grave goods, might be more personal items, but it's not clear always that these might have been items that belonged to the deceased. They might have actually been placed as gifts by the mourners. Christian burials tend to be much more simple than pre-Christian ones. They also tend to be oriented east-west as well for religious reasons. In the case of England, your article that you've got to read from Studley is about Anglo-Saxon England around this conversion period. So Christianity replaced the pagan indigenous religions of the English around the 7th and 8th centuries AD. In the north of England, Irish Christianity was introduced into Northumbria and Mercia by monks from Ireland. But by the time of the Synod of Whitby, it was Roman Catholic Christianity throughout the whole of England and the British Isles. So Christians, even today, do not bury people with grave goods. It's not like the old Egyptian pharaohs where they were given everything they needed for the afterlife. Christians have very simple burials. So we can tell it's Christian burials because of this and because of the east-west orientation. But this is actually difficult from an archaeological perspective because we rely on material culture to also date things from the past. And if it's a very simple burial, then we're really going to struggle with providing a date for it. But the Anglo-Saxon burials, pre-Christianity, often have a lot of grave goods. We see a lot of dress fittings, we see a lot of jewellery, but also weapons. So that ties back to last week's theme on power, and you can read more about that in the Studley article too. So that article on Moodle, it's up on Moodle for you. It's pretty good for explaining the links between life cycles and grave goods. And so you should definitely go and read that. Now, it isn't just a case for burials as in like, they didn't really bury people in coffins in the Middle Ages. They would bury them in shrouds instead. So that is, they would be wrapped in a fabric and buried that way. But then we've got some more elaborate burials. For example, maybe ship burials. And one of the best studied examples of this, again, comes from Anglo-Saxon England. So comes from early medieval England. And this is the Sutton Hoo ship burial. So Sutton Hoo is probably the most famous of these types of burials. And actually, it's really interesting if you've ever read Beowulf, there's some of the material culture that's discussed in Beowulf is reflected in these ship burials like at Sutton Hoo. So the Anglo-Saxons are very well known archaeologically for their artwork, particularly their metalworking skills, very, very talented metal workers. So a lot of art historians look at the metalworks, particularly like brooches, clasps, and use this to identify patterns like that there's like continental types or Germanic styles in jewellery and other metalwork, and really some of the most spectacular finds of these different international production houses can be found at Sutton Hoo. Sutton Hoo, we reckon, dates from around the 620s. So it comes from this cusp of Christianization. It's around the period of widespread conversion to Christianity in the British Isles. Sutton Hoo was first excavated in 1939, but it is still being identified to this day. Thanks to Sutton Hoo, we now don't view Anglo-Saxon society as being inferior to Roman Britain, because it shows how culturally developed the Anglo-Saxons were. Sutton Hoo is a ship burial. It was deeply buried underneath a large mound. And what you see on the right there is a photograph from the early excavations of a 27-metre long oak constructed ship. At its centre was a ruined burial chamber the size of a small room, and it was hung with textiles. In it was one dead man, he's obviously dead, but just a man, one man, and he lay surrounded by lots of material culture. He was buried with weapons, he was buried with armour, he was buried with wealth in the form of gold coins and gold and garnet fittings. There were silver vessels, silver-mounted drinking horns and cups, and also clothes. So these were all taken to be symbols of power and authority. Again, a link to last week. So this leads us to be like, okay, well, who was this person? We don't have any written documentation, but, you know, definitely, if not a king, then somebody super wealthy and super important based on these grave goods. Now, we also have, on the topic of deposited material culture, we also have hoards. And a really good example of a recently discovered hoard is this one, the Staffordshire hoard. Again, same time period, roughly, from England. Staffordshire hoard must have been found about 10 years ago now, and it was found in a farmer's field. There's, as you can see on this table here, a lot of stuff in it. That's around 3,500 items, and it dates from the 7th and 8th centuries. It has been valued conservatively at over $5 million worth. It is enough material culture from this Anglo-Saxon period to hugely advance our knowledge of their culture. It was, unfortunately, though, found by a metal detectorist. Don't start me a metal detectorist, I don't like them. And that's because they go around beeping for metal, and then they find something metal, and they dig it out, and they completely destroy the context. And you know what? Archaeologists care about the context. We care about the stratigraphy and what the context can tell us more about the culture, not the item and artifact necessarily itself. But look, that aside, I'm not going to go on a rant. Despite our appearance to modern eyes, which we just look at as a go, ooh, gold, pretty, shiny, it's actually a very military type hoard. It's a very male hoard, we think. Why was it there? Well, that's the big question. Some people have suggested that it's a votive deposit, that is a ritual deposit to gods, but I think that's a bit overkill, to be honest. It might be a treasure test, or it could be the spoils accumulated from many military victories. So basically what we're looking at here are military trophies, or maybe it's what was handed up to a king by noble families when the nobles died, and this was the king's armourer hiding it. Because remember, there's no banks in this time period, not until much later, and in Italy do we know we get banking. So yeah, you had something you wanted to hide, dug a hole, hide it in there, and hopefully you came back and got it, but evidently this person did not come back and get it. There's the link that's on this slide here is also on the Nearpod for you, so have a look at the link here. I recommend you watch the video. It's pretty quick and lets you have a look at what some of the items are, and then have a look at the pictures and see all the beautiful metalworking. When I was at grad school, I have a lot of graduate hours in Anglo-Saxons, and my professor was one of the big names in Anglo-Saxon archaeology, and her interests were metalworking and settlement. So I came to teach, and one of the first courses that I taught after I got my PhD was in Anglo-Saxon history, and was shocked to realize that there was more to the Anglo-Saxons than gold and really rubbish house construction. Their houses, or Gruppenhausen, are like hovels. And from an archaeological perspective, I always had the impression that Anglo-Saxons lived in hovels, but looked totally bling while doing it. And then when I came to having to teach the history, it was like, wow, this is completely a different narrative than I've been exposed to. So, okay, there's an example of why it's important for these different disciplines to talk to one another. Moving away from the artifacts found with burials to the burials themselves, your starting point, oops, wrong one, is a video lecture about osteoarchaeology. Now, this does overlap a lot with your textbook, and it doesn't just limit itself to the Middle Ages, though lots of the examples the professor draws from are medieval. But you might prefer to watch it rather than read, especially if you're not feeling confident in your scientific abilities and you find the textbook reading a bit confusing. I think she does a really good job of explaining it to an intelligent, complete newcomer. But if you're happy with your understanding from the textbook about, you know, how the methodologies that you can use to look at burials, then you can fast forward to about 25 minutes in. And at that point, she starts to talk about the specific diseases. She's going to talk about tuberculosis. She's going to talk about syphilis, and she's going to talk about leprosy. And those were all diseases present in medieval populations. They're all referenced in your reading about medieval women, which I'll come to in a minute. So we're going to look at 3 examples of osteoarchaeology. First off, I'm going to tell you a little bit about deviant burials. And don't get too disappointed, but if we were in class, we would totally be looking at like most of one class on deviant burials. But my books on deviant burials are all locked up in the library, so I'm just going to have to give you a quick overview. We're not going to do that much detail about deviant burials because everything we need is inaccessible. So, then you're going to read an article about the osteoarchaeology of medieval women. And that's really interesting because, as we know, women are very hard to trace in the material culture. And this article actually sets out to look at women as underrepresented, and in particular ordinary women, and try and uncover what their lives were like based on assessing their bones as material culture. It's a really interesting read. Then the last case study for osteoarchaeology is going to be from a charnel house. So this is like a place where, you know, they enter a church where they put bones. And they actually, and this will be of interest to us, have assessed it using 3D methods. So it's another version of what we should have been doing for our projects had COVID-19 not hit. Okay, deviant burials. Now, these are very grainy images, but they're what I had out of the books that I would have been showing you had we got class. And if we were in class, I'd be like, look at these grainy pictures and tell me what looks odd about these burials. So these are called deviant burials. Now, all the deviant burials mean is that it's a burial that is different from the way a culture usually buries its dead for whatever reason. So, for example, if there's been a battle and the victims of the battle are all buried very hastily, but otherwise properly and according to, you know, Christian rituals, that's still a deviant burial. Massacre victims are another one, or plague victims. Those are the deviant burials. But the ones that we would have looked at in class are the criminal burials. What happened to you with you? How do we tell that you were a criminal and then executed and buried? And that's because we're looking for some really weird stuff. The guy on the left here, if you haven't noticed, is a criminal burial. How do we know that? The hands are still tied. This is a main indication that the person buried was a criminal, along with, if you look at the shape of the body here, this is called a prone burial. That means that it's face down. You think about burials today, people are put on their backs, and that is true throughout history, but this person is face down with their hands tied behind their back. They were likely executed for being a criminal. If there is no other evidence, and I don't think there is in this case, probably they were killed by hanging. In the late Anglo-Saxon period, there are actually special execution cemeteries where almost all the people uncovered have their hands tied or face down. A lot of them have also been decapitated, so they've had their heads chopped off. And in these late Anglo-Saxon period burial sites, they're pretty much overwhelmingly male in terms of their sex. A lot of these cemeteries are associated with meeting places or markets. So, you know, they're probably being used to, you know, show what happens if you don't toe the line. So we might see judicial executions, if we can see signs of decapitation, or we can see signs of mutilation, or the burials are very shallow and cramped. Decapitation was known for people who had died in unnatural or unknown circumstances. On the right there, these are decapitated burials. If you look at these closely, you'll see that the heads are nowhere near where they're supposed to be. And because there's multiple ones of these are probably the, had been the survivors of a battle. And they were then executed by the victorious forces and put into a mass burial. That is likely what happened here. We might know if somebody is a murder victim if they're found with multiple wounds to the back of the head, or possibly this poor lady here, which shows evidence of being stoned, weighed down with stones. This woman is between the ages of 35 and 45. As you can see, she is a prone burial, but she's also contorted in shape, and this has led archaeologists to interpret her as possibly a live burial. We think that she was hit over the head with a stone and her skull cracked to subdue her. So you see, sometimes I show this picture to students and they're like, oh, why is she lying like that? Well, there is a stone that is sitting above her pelvis. Well, you can see it in the actual image and then the reconstruction on the left. That's not there by accident. That's the stone that she was smacked over the head with. Then she was just tossed into this grave and buried, possibly alive. And the stone was dumped in there with her. She was probably a murder victim. So, speaking of women, the next article for you to read and then discuss, this is going to tie in with one of the discussion questions posted on your Nearpod, is about the evidence for the lives of women that comes from their remains. The article points out from the onset that women are often ignored from academic studies. So it's a really, really interesting article, not just from the academic perspective of what bodies, what the material culture of burials can tell us, but also it tells us things like about life cycles, childbirth experiences, occupations of women. It's a really interesting read. So the last thing then to discuss from our archaeology. Oh, there's our images of women. So here's some contemporary manuscript women of women eating, milking animals, playing musical instruments, weaving, all women from all sorts of lives. Well, let's see what their bones tell us that are counterpart to these images. But the last one are the charnel houses, okay? So there's going to be a link here in Nearpod to the Rothwell Charnel Chapel project, which is attempted to study, digitally reconstruct and formulate preservation ideas for one of only 2 charnel houses in England that still hold their original human remains. The link that I'm going to give you, you should go down to the bottom of that page and have a look at the video. It's about 10 minutes long, which is a really nice overview. And then have a look, there's also a link to the digital reconstructions. And what I'd like you to consider is how they're using 3D imaging as a historic preservation tool. I know lots of you are HP majors, so this should get you thinking about sort of how technology can be used by preservationists. Once you've done all that, head over to Flipgrid as usual. But for Flipgrid, what I'm really interested in hearing from you is how historians and historic preservationists can use interdisciplinary studies to make new advances in our understanding of the past. That's what I'd like you to consider and discuss in particular in Flipgrid. Okay, so next week we're talking about manuscript culture. And if you haven't seen it already, I posted a forum to get feedback on an idea for the final exam on Moodle.